Medieval warfare wasn't won by strength alone. While knights rode into battle wrapped in steel and pride, it was often the archers, silent, distant, and deadly, who truly controlled the outcome. Their arrows didn't just pierce armor, they broke formations, morale, and the very idea that honor on horseback ruled the battlefield. In an age built around the image of the knight, it was the archer who quietly rewrote the rules of war. Number 1. Power and precision from a distance. In medieval warfare, the idea that knights were the ultimate battlefield force has become deeply embedded in popular culture, but a closer look at real combat dynamics reveals a very different picture. Archers, particularly longbowmen, brought a type of controlled destruction to the battlefield that knights simply couldn't counter effectively. Their power didn't lie in brute strength or intimidating armor, it was in their ability to eliminate threats before they ever got close. A skilled archer could loose up to 12 arrows per minute, each one a high-speed projectile that could maim or kill even a well-armored opponent. These weren't casual shots either. Medieval archery training, especially in England, was intensive and institutionalized. It wasn't just a skill, it was a military priority. By the time an English longbowman reached adulthood, he had spent years building the physical strength to draw a bow with a pull weight exceeding 100 pounds. That strength translated into deadly energy, and when hundreds of archers fired in volleys, the result was terrifying. The longbow stood out not just because of its size, often taller than the archer himself, but because of its sheer range and armor-piercing potential. In ideal conditions, an arrow could reach distances beyond 250 yards, and even at over 150 yards, it retained enough kinetic energy to punch through mail and compromise the joints or visors in plate armor. This wasn't theoretical. It happened in real battles. At the Battle of Crécy in 1346, English longbowmen devastated waves of French cavalry, and again at Agincourt in 1415, where the muddy terrain combined with relentless arrow volleys turned the field into a graveyard of steel-clad nobles. Knights who had spent years and fortunes preparing for glory were cut down before ever reaching the enemy lines. The psychological effect of this can't be understated. Charging into a hailstorm of arrows that you can't defend against drains confidence and weakens discipline. Two things absolutely critical for close quarters combat effectiveness. Knights were designed for one-on-one duels or decisive shock charges. Archers, in contrast, worked together as part of a carefully positioned firepower network. Their role was not only to inflict casualties, but to disrupt formations, scatter cohesion, and create confusion before the enemy even entered striking distance. That level of influence over a battle's tempo gave them strategic value far beyond their individual weapons. Archers forced armies to think differently, adapt formations, and eventually rethink the dominance of cavalry. Their distance was their defense, their precision was their offense, and their presence alone reshaped how medieval battles unfolded long before swords ever clashed. Number 2, cheaper, faster, and easier to train. The image of the medieval knight is often tied to prestige, discipline, and elite status, but the reality of war wasn't so accommodating to romantic ideals. Knights were expensive investments, not just in gold, but in time, training, and social structure. Becoming a knight required a noble lineage, or at least patronage, years of squirehood, and a deeply embedded feudal support system that included horses, squires, armorers, and servants. Their equipment alone could cost more than a skilled laborer would earn in a decade. A full suit of plate armor was often custom-fitted and forged by master craftsmen. Add to that a trained warhorse, weapons, and the costs of living and maintenance, and you're looking at a walking military fortune. All of this made knights valuable but rare, and in a war of attrition, rarity can be a fatal flaw. In contrast, archers represented a more democratic and scalable form of military power. They didn't need noble birth or extensive support infrastructure. Many came from the ranks of commoners, yeomen, farmers, town laborers, who grew up with the bow as part of daily life. In England especially, the longbow was not only a tool of war, but a mandated skill. Laws like the Assize of Arms and later statutes under Edward III required men to practice archery on Sundays and holidays. This wasn't a casual hobby, it was structured preparation for war. By the time a teenager reached adulthood, he had potentially thousands of hours of practice with a weapon that could decide battles. The muscle development needed to draw a longbow was immense, but it came naturally over years of consistent use. This system allowed England to cultivate a large pool of competent archers without the monumental cost that came with knightly cavalry. The economic difference between the two types of soldiers had strategic consequences. A commander could field several dozen archers for the price of one knight, and while a knight may have been more durable in one-on-one combat, battles were rarely that clean. In open field warfare, massed archery could weaken or break enemy lines long before melee engagement. Quantity mattered, but it wasn't just about numbers. A unit of trained archers was efficient, fast to deploy, and significantly more flexible. They could be stationed behind stakes, placed in forests, or moved up flanks depending on terrain. This adaptability contrasted sharply with the rigid needs of cavalry, which required flat, open ground and logistical support. Another key difference was resilience. If a knight was killed, it was a political and social blow, often involving land inheritance issues, family honor, and local power vacuums. If an archer fell, he was mourned, but replaced quickly and without structural disruption. This gave medieval commanders tactical freedom. They could risk archers in large numbers, push them forward in exposed positions, or use them in experimental formations, all without threatening the overall integrity of their military command. Over time, this made archers the backbone of many medieval armies, especially in campaigns where long supply chains, fast maneuvering, and attrition were unavoidable. Their low cost, fast development, and scalable utility shifted the balance of power, not only in individual battles, but in how medieval states planned for war. Number 3. Superior mobility and battlefield control. In the rigid structure of medieval warfare, mobility was not just a tactical asset, it was often the deciding factor between victory and disaster. Knights, for all their martial glory, were limited in how and where they could fight effectively. Clad in full-plate armor that could weigh up to 60 pounds, carrying shields, lances, and swords, and mounted on equally armored warhorses, knights moved with force but lacked agility. They were engineered for open field combat, where they could charge in formation, break through lines with momentum, and engage in brutal close-quarters clashes. But this kind of performance was conditional. It demanded dry ground, space to maneuver, and clear visibility. When any of these elements was missing, when the battlefield became wet, narrow, wooded, or broken by natural obstacles, the knight's advantage began to erode quickly. Archers, on the other hand, thrived in unpredictable conditions. Their role on the battlefield was never about brute force. It was about precision, positioning, and movement. Unlike knights, archers didn't need to wait for the enemy to come close. They could operate from behind cover, adjust their firing positions with minimal effort, and relocate rapidly if the situation shifted. Forests that would trap cavalry became natural strongholds for archers. Hills provided line-of-sight advantages, while swampy or muddy terrain, which spelled disaster for heavily armored knights, barely slowed down archers who traveled light and fought from a distance. This meant that archers weren't just fighters, they were terrain specialists, turning environmental challenges into strategic tools. The Battle of Agincourt is perhaps the most cited proof of this. In 1415, an English force significantly outnumbered by the French used a combination of archers and natural terrain to devastating effect. The English dug in behind sharpened wooden stakes, forcing any attacking cavalry to slow down and funnel through narrow, muddy paths. Rain had turned the field into a mire, making it impossible for French knights to charge properly. As they slogged through the mud, weighed down by their own armor and disorganized by the terrain, English longbowmen continuously fired into their ranks. By the time the knights reached the English lines, they were exhausted, vulnerable, and easily overwhelmed. But mobility wasn't just about avoiding poor conditions. It allowed archers to shape the battle's rhythm. They could advance or retreat without losing effectiveness, reposition to exploit weak spots in the enemy formation, or split into flanking groups that harassed from the sides. They were less dependent on central commands, and more capable of making quick decisions in response to battlefield developments. In effect, archers gave commanders tactical flexibility that knights simply couldn't provide. A mobile force that could engage without engaging directly was far more adaptable, especially during prolonged campaigns where quick repositioning and terrain exploitation were crucial. Knights were valuable, no doubt, but once the terrain turned against them, their presence could become a liability. Archers, operating with fewer physical constraints, adapted where knights faltered, controlled the flow of battle with fewer numbers, and dictated engagements on their own terms. That capacity to manipulate the battlefield through movement and strategic placement made archers not only more efficient but often more decisive. Number 4. Psychological warfare and group tactics. The battlefield in the Middle Ages was not only a physical contest but a mental one, and few elements of medieval warfare attacked the mind as effectively as a well-coordinated unit of archers. Unlike knights, whose presence relied on visible symbols of status and intimidation, shining armor, crested helmets, massive warhorses, archers operated from the shadows of that spectacle. They didn't need to be seen to strike fear. Their impact was not in display, but in anticipation, and more often, in what you heard before you saw anything. The psychological weight of incoming volleys, launched in carefully timed waves, was enough to cause panic in even the most disciplined formations. A single arrow could kill, but hundreds fired at once turned the sky into a weapon, a whistling wall of death that disrupted enemy lines long before swords were drawn. Archers were not individual performers. They were trained to operate in synchronized formations, responding to signals or commands, launching arrows in overlapping patterns that created kill zones across the battlefield. The English longbowmen, especially during the 100 Years' War, mastered this method of controlled volley fire, using terrain and spacing to ensure that their arrows landed where they were most likely to create disruption. These weren't scattered shots hoping for luck. They were deliberately placed barrages meant to fracture the confidence of approaching forces, to force them to slow down, to make them rethink the charge. The sound of hundreds of bows releasing at once, the immediate impact of arrows clattering into shields, armor, and bodies, It all contributed to an atmosphere where panic could spread faster than orders. This kind of mental warfare was particularly effective against cavalry charges, which depended heavily on momentum and unity. Once a charge was disrupted by confusion, hesitation, or losses from an initial volley, its power was largely neutralized. The armor of knights might protect them from a single arrow, but no armor could defend against the creeping realization that death could come from above at any moment, and that there was no clear target to fight back against. Archers, especially when protected by stakes or positioned in difficult terrain, were difficult to reach, and that inaccessibility added to the fear. You couldn't fight what you couldn't reach, and soldiers are less likely to charge into fire when they're unsure if they'll even get a chance to strike back. Unlike knights, who thrived on reputation, glory, and one-on-one valor, archers functioned as an impersonal force. They weren't remembered for their names, but for the effect they had as a unit. They represented a